In 3, 2, and 1. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another part 2 of the Create series. We've been having a really good time with our Create series, and we're just so thankful that you are able to join Urban Teachers for this free webinar series aimed at helping teachers and practitioners create dynamic, culturally relevant mathematics and STEM lessons. And these webinar series, what makes these webinar series so unique and so creative is that they are for teachers, for practitioners, by practitioners. And so we're so grateful for you for being with us on the journey. The Create series was begun this year, 2021. We hope it to be an annual event. We have 3 webinars planned. The first one was held on March 10th, Promising Practices for Centering Language in Mathematics Teaching. Today, we're talking about building culturally relevant mathematics tasks. And next week, we'll be talking about the hope and power of hip hop in teaching math and science. If you are listening to this video live, or if you want to listen to a replay of this video series, they will be up at the Urban Teachers website. That's urbanteachers.org /education -events. You should see that on the screen. For more information, you can also email me. I am Dr. Lou Matthews. You can email me at lou.matthews@urbanteachers.org or mathsci, MATHSEI, @urbanteachers.org. I'm excited to join in with you today. Thank you for all of the people that are watching us from Bermuda, from the United States, but I'm excited to have joining with us today 2 excellent presenters, Amy Wendel and Elizabeth Pefaure. Elizabeth, did I say your name right? Elizabeth Pefaure?
Pefaure.
Okay, great. Help me.
Pefaure.
Pefaure. And so
Yes.
I apologize if I've not said that
It's
correctly.
okay.
But a little bit about Amy and Elizabeth. Amy is a graduate of Boston University with a master's in elementary education. She's been working in education for quite some time, working in urban schools in and around DC, since spending the bulk of her career working at a DC charter school, Capital City Public Charter School, which is an expeditionary learning school. Amy spent half of her career as a classroom teacher and the latter half as an administrative coach and principal before joining us here at Urban Teachers / Johns Hopkins, where her primary focus is in early childhood. She's a phenomenal partner, critical friend partner to work on in issues of mathematics and equity. And they've always been at the forefront of her work here as an educator. Elizabeth, Liz Pefaure, has been a DC educator for 12 years. Her experience is in elementary grades as well. And her focus is on math curriculum development and coaching. She has been an instructional coach with Urban Teachers here for 2 years. And last summer has joined the Johns Hopkins University side of our partnership as an adjunct faculty member teaching mathematics and literacy courses to our participants. And in our teaching network, her passion, as you'll see in the webinar, is teaching, has always been around mathematics, and she continues to seek opportunities to grow. So I'm so excited to have these 2 wonderful people to deliver to you building culturally relevant mathematics tasks, as you can see on your screen. And without further ado, I'd like to turn the virtual stage over to both Liz and Amy. Welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you, Lou. Before we start with our planned content, I just wanted to take just a minute to honor. I'm sure everybody by now has heard about the terrible, tragic events in Atlanta, where 8 people were killed yesterday evening in a killing spree. Though they're not saying 100% confirmed, it does appear to be yet another hate crime against Asian Americans this time. And so just in solidarity and alongside their families, I'd like to hold a minute of silence for the victims and their families. So let's just go ahead and do that now. Thanks all.
Great. Thank you, Amy, for that space. And thank you, Lou, for the wonderful introduction. So welcome, everyone. We want to name before we dig into this work that Amy and I are here alongside this journey with you all. We are not experts. We are simply willing participants in doing the same hard work that we are making our teachers do, and making sure that this work is even more powerful for our students. Tonight, we are sharing ideas from experts and how we have found success using these ideas to make our teaching more culturally relevant. So we're going to begin with our session outcomes. So as we begin our work, we want our participants, you all, to discover the power of culturally relevant tasks and how it can engage your students in important and meaningful ways while simultaneously helping them achieve academically. We also hope that we are able to unpack the what and the how of teaching mathematics in culturally relevant ways.
And finally, we hope that we can reflect and commit during this session. We hope to, we had planned to offer you times throughout the session to reflect on your practice and on the things that we're talking about. And hopefully by the end, you feel ready to commit to your next step, wherever that may be, wherever you are on your journey. And just a note on our process for this evening. We plan to kind of be in presenters mode for the beginning and have to save time for questions and wonderings at the end of the session. So please do take time to jot down any questions you have, any wonderings, anything that's coming up for you, so that you can bring those things up at the end in our questions and wonderings time. Okay. All right, so we are going to start with a few norms. What we hope can be our norms for this session this evening are, we really hope that we all can participate in helping to create a safe space for everyone. What we mean by this is to be open to and respectful of new ideas, and to be okay where you are on this journey. Everyone's in a different place. This is a lifelong journey, in our opinion. And we're all, like I mentioned, in different spaces in this work. And that's excellent. We hope to, help you continue your process, but let's think of this as a process and not like a finish line type thing. And finally, we invite you to reflect as openly as you feel comfortable to do so. And then our last norm is around staying engaged. We really hope that everyone can, obviously you're here because you want to be here, and so engage as fully as you're able to this evening.
Thank you. So the first task we want to reflect is, first, we want you all to jot down in a space, whether it's a piece of paper, your journal, maybe through a tablet you have, or whatever is in front of you, but to stop and think about these two questions. How do you define a culturally relevant task? And what excites you about this work? And we are going to be coming back to these questions, so it's important for you to have a space to write them down. And we'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. We have about a minute left. Great, thank you. So again, please make sure you're able to come back to this. Now we're going to get into the what of culturally relevant tasks. So Dr. Matthews and colleagues have defined a culturally relevant task is a task that offers academic rigor, is centered in real-world relevant situations, and requires students examine conditions of opportunity, justice, and inequity that arise in their communities, school, and the world around them. And this work really also stems from Gloria Lenton Billings' 3 tenets, which are academic excellence, cultural competence, and critical consciousness.
Okay, thanks, Liz. There's a lot going on in that definition. There's a lot to unpack, so to speak. We're going to dig into this culturally relevant, cognitively demanding rubric, also designed by Dr. Matthews and his colleagues, that I think helps us dig into the language of this a little bit more. I am going to just make it a little bigger. Thanks, Liz. Okay. So you'll notice in this rubric that there are kind of 3 levels that kind of can help you define where your culturally relevant task falls in terms of, how kind of deeply relevant to your students is it. And I think when I first saw this rubric, and this is full transparency, I was in an expeditionary learning school. We did a lot of project-based learning. We developed expeditions that were really aligned, what we felt like were aligned to issues of social justice and cultural relevance. But when I looked at this rubric, I realized that a lot of times things that when I thought I was at my peak, at my ceiling of culturally relevant tasks, I was really actually still at this emerging level. And so this was really an eye-opening experience for me, and it really has helped me think more deeply about sort of what makes a really exemplary task. So I just talk you very briefly through this rubric. At your emerging level, your task is cognitively demanding. It's mathematically rich. It really requires considerable effort for your students to solve it. There are multiple entryways, etc. And this task will draw from connections to other subjects, disciplines, and concepts. But that's sort of where the connection to cultural relevance ends in the emerging level, is sort of that connection. As you move into developing, again, you're still rooted with that cognitively demanding math task, but for your task to be at the developing level as a culturally relevant task, it really needs to be embedded into the culture, the students' lives, their community, in a way where it's an inquiry-based learning. So the task is really centered in a real world situation, and it requires students to think more deeply about themselves and their communities. And then moving into that exemplary, again, cognitive demand is at that base. Your task is embedded in cultural inquiry and activity, but your target is getting at this community empowerment piece and social justice. There's something of relevance and that offers agency to your students in tackling the task. And so that, just to think about those layers of cultural relevance in task building, and really think about where your task lies and kind of what you can do to kind of continue to raise the level of cultural relevance of your task.
Great. So now that we've unpacked a little bit of the what of the cultural relevant task, let's go back to our original definition of what you wrote down of what a culturally relevant task is, and think about what else can you add on to your definition? Where did you come in with some understanding of it that connected to what we just shared, and just build off of that. So take about 30 seconds to do that, or even add new knowledge that you have to define a culturally relevant task. Thank you, Amy. So now that we have more understanding of what a culturally relevant task is, now we're going to get into the how. So when we talk about the how, Amy and I kind of identified this area as being the intersectionality of critical practice, right? So this means we must grow cultural knowledge of our students. We must center community into the math that we teach, and we must design tasks that allow for authentic connection and empowerment. And when we thought about these critical practices, we saw this as a Venn diagram, because when these three areas come together, this is where we have culturally relevant and academically rigorous mathematics tasks. So we really need to have these three areas come together in order for us to begin our work. So as we begin our work, we're going to first start off with the learner, or the cultural knowledge.
Okay. Okay. So thinking about building your relationships with students, what do you know about your students culturally, is kind of where we're positioning this critical practice. And so I'd like to introduce you to the work of Zaretta Hammond, who is a leading thinker on the work of building cultural relevance in our teaching and in our instruction. And just take 30 seconds to read this quote by Zaretta Hammond. Okay. Okay, so now that you've taken a quick read of this quote, we are going to take a look at her culture tree in just a second. But this is, again, a lot of words, this is really meaty. So I'd like you to just take a few seconds to think about what's coming up for you in this quote. What are some words or phrases that are standing out to you? And we're going to do a little word cloud around this so that we can kind of get a collective look at sort of what's coming up for people. I have put in the chat a link to menti.com, which will take you to this word cloud, or you can scan your phone with this, scan this scanner. Oh, sorry, I don't know the language for that, to get to that word cloud as well. And then you'll be prompted to offer just a couple words that come up for you around Hammond's kind of introduction to her culture tree. Yes, I will put the coding in. Hold on a sec here. Oops, we'll give you one more time there. Are you able to access the?
So we have some words coming up.
Mm-hmm. think a couple of people are asking me for the link again, so let's just give it a second. Panels and attendees. Okay, maybe it's not. Okay, I'll check that.
Oh, I see what happened. There we go. We're getting a few more.
Yeah, I think I just put it to panelists. Sorry about that, guys.
I'm going to go back to the quote in case some people are still thinking.
Maybe about 10 more seconds. Okay.
Okay, we got a few more.
So just everyone can kind of take a look at this and sort of notice probably same things I'm noticing. Roots is a word that came up a number of times that stands out to folks. Deep culture, surface culture, systems change, her story, fighting systems. Excellent. Well, thank you all for participating in that. And so now we're going to actually take a look at the tree.
Before we look at the tree.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. So before we actually look at Zaretta Hammond's tree, first, we really want you to engage in a quick 1-minute activity where we just want you to make a list of your students or a list of students that you engage with on a regular basis. So if you're here as an administrator in a coaching role, we want you to think about those students that you might engage with on a regular basis or a consistent basis. And so just take a minute to write down those names. So now that you've had some time to write down names, think about those students you immediately thought about and those that took you a minute to recall, right? So, and we're going to keep that in mind as we now engage with the tree.
Sorry, I get very excited about Hammond's culture tree. Jumped the gun there a little bit. Okay, so if you take a close look at Hammond's culture tree, you'll notice that she has sort of identified culture in 3 different ways, 3 different levels here. You'll see surface culture, which is at the top of the tree. It's kind of indicated, words on leaves are kind of indicating that surface culture. The surface culture, according to Hammond, are the observable patterns in a culture. So things that you can kind of see, they're visible. They're, that you can sort of access them fairly easily, like the food of a culture, the language, the music that they like to listen to, or the clothing that they prefer. What is the literature of that culture? The holidays. And then as you move further down in the tree, the trunk of the tree, it's a big important part of the tree. It's also a big important part of culture, is the shallow culture. These are the unspoken rules in a culture. They're not as visible as those at the surface level. And really getting to know a culture at this level requires a fairly significant amount of trust. And it requires the learner, the teacher in this case, to really embed yourself in the culture, to situate yourself within that culture so that you're able to sort of build trust with those in the culture, so that you can kind of have more access to these kind of more unspoken, unseen rules of a culture. You can see some of the examples: eye contact, concepts of time, the nature of relationships. What is honest? What is honest? What is the culture of honesty in a culture? And so these are, again, it requires an element of trust among you and your students to be able to access the shallow culture. And then Hammond identified deep culture. And deep culture is kind of that collective unconscious, the beliefs and norms of a culture. Again, these are not things that you can visibly see or hear. You need to develop an intense level of emotional trust with the people that you are committing to getting to know, to joining a culture, being a part of a culture, to really be able to have that sort of access that collective unconscious. And some things that you'll see in deep culture, according to Hammond, are how cultures make decisions. What is the spirituality of a culture? What are notions of fairness? How does a culture relate to nature and animals? Just an example of, just to pull out one example, thinking about cultures and their relationships to nature and animals. I think something that is somewhat visible in deep culture is this relationship with animals. Some cultures, it's perfectly reasonable and acceptable to have pets living in your home, so humans and pets living together under the same roof. In other cultures, that's just not something that is a part of the culture. So that's sort of a more simple example of what deep culture might look like or be, that Hammond identifies. And so thinking about what you know about your students and where your knowledge of them, about them, with them kind of lies, according to Hammond's culture tree.
So now that we've taken a look at the culture tree, and now that we've also reflected on our students, let's also think about now, where does the information we know about the students that we made on our list, where does the information we have, where does that lie on the tree? And also think about, do you notice that you know more about some students rather than other students? Is the knowledge that you have of these students clustered in one area, or does it span across the 3 different levels of the culture tree? Where is your information lacking? So I'm going to take us back to the tree so that as you're beginning to think about what do you know about those students on the list, where does that information lie? Now we want you to think about, what would your next step be? So if the knowledge you have of your students lies in the surface culture, what would your next step be in order to get to the shallow culture? If you have surface and shallow culture of your students because you've built that much trust, have built that much trust within your classroom community, how are you going to get to the deep culture? Or maybe, and it's okay because we all have different entry points into today's session, maybe we're not even at the surface culture yet. And what are we going to do? But these 3 areas of the tree are all critical. There's not one that's more that has to be done first, but you can definitely attain all 3. But we cannot have these 3 layers in order and still be able to develop culturally relevant math tasks.
Hey, Liz, can I add something here?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Something I wanted to say earlier, but just a couple things. The first is, and Lou, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think that these levels of culture are meant to be hierarchical in nature. One's not more important. You could argue that you have to get to deep culture to really have a deep understanding of your students, and to really be able to situate yourself within that culture. But they're all important entryways into what you know about your students. And then the other thing is, when I think back to my classroom teaching days, when I think of deep culture as defined by Hammond, these are the things that I think helped my knowledge of students and my relationships with them, that helped me kind of embed myself into the culture, their culture, and to build our community culture in the classroom, was really built on this understanding of deep culture. I think that you have to have a safe space in your classroom, a community where your students feel safe, they feel like they can take risks, especially in digging into issues of social justice, those hard conversations that we all really need to have the courage to have with our students. I think that the knowledge of deep culture, the understanding there, really does help you build that community in your classroom. So I think there's another access point to that there that I just wanted to make sure that I said. Thanks.
Thank you, Amy. So now that we've taken a look at how to get at that deep culture of our students and the different layers of the cultural knowledge that we can have of our students, the next critical practice area that is also important is the math. And so what we mean by this is, as educators, we need to ensure that we know that where does a standard live within my students, right? So we're really thinking about, when I'm getting ready to teach and I'm ready to either design or redesign a task, where does this math live within my students, within the community? And we have to be able to unpack that standard or the standards associated with the task in order to make the verbs come alive for them. So an example I have here is a 5th grade fraction standard. Use equivalent fractions as a strategy to add and subtract fractions. So as I'm thinking about this standard, I'm also thinking about, how is my community using fractions in order for me to make this task more relevant, more accessible to my students. I'm also beginning to think about what are the verbs within the standard that my students need to know, that I'm going to begin to infuse within my task, right? So where is the rigor? What's that entry point for the rigor going to be for my task? So this is what we mean when we say center community in the math. Really think about your standards and where do you see it living within your students. And the last circle here, the last critical practice, is the task design.
Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about that. So in thinking about designing your task, Liz and I kind of identified some, not necessarily steps, but some things to consider as you're designing your task. I would say always starting with the rubric to guide you is really important. There's a lot of great language in that rubric to help you center your task. And then we added a few. Really think about this task as a real life celebration, puzzle, or issue. We chose those words carefully. We want to be careful not to think about culturally relevant tasks as always just solving a problem that sometimes suggests a deficit-minded view. We want to also think about the celebrations of math in a culture, like where does math live in your culture that's to be celebrated, if there's a puzzle to solve. So think broadly about tasks as celebrations, puzzles, or issues. We also find it powerful to use primary source documents and real data whenever possible. Thinking about, again, what Liz was talking about, where is the community and culture of your students in the task? What is relevant to students about this particular math content? And also just thinking about making sure that your task is developmentally appropriate for your students and that matches what they need to learn at that time.
So at this point, once you've acquired the cultural knowledge of your students, once you've acquired the understanding of the math and where it lies in the community within your students. Now we have two pathways to choose, right? We can choose the really pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and designing your own task that meets the needs of the standard, the rigor, will challenge your students and provide them with multiple entry points. Or we can also think about, how do we adapt and redesign tasks that are already given to us through our curriculum that we use? So we are going to provide an example of how we can adapt a Eureka task to meet the needs of our students, to make it more culturally relevant for them. So I have an example here of a 5th grade Eureka task from Module 3, Lesson 3, and it is around using equivalent fractions as a strategy to add fractions. So the problem starts off with, Mr. Sanofsky used 5/8 of a tank of gas on a trip to visit relatives for the weekend, and another 1/2 of a tank commuting to work the next week. He then took another weekend trip and used a 1/4 tank of gas. How many tanks of gas did Mr. Sanofsky use altogether? In my teaching experience with my students, when I was a 5th grade classroom teacher, as I looked at this problem, I first wanted to think about, where does this problem lie within the rubric? And what I knew about my students was that where our campus lied, most of my students would travel to school using public transportation or walking. So when I'm looking at this rubric, I'm thinking, well, there's rigor in this task because students need to know about fractions. They need to know how to create equivalent fractions. They need to know how to add those fractions, creating equivalent fractions in order to find their solution. So it's really at this emerging level, right? Because it has that rigor. It has some kind of connection across content areas. This could be linked to a social studies problem, right? But as I really began to unpack what this meant for my students, I soon discovered that they're not going to be able to make a connection if what I knew about my students was the majority of them living in DC travel through public transportation. So I'm now going through this task, and I've highlighted the pieces that my students will not be able to make an authentic connection to, right? So that's the first off, is this Mr. Sanofsky person. They're not going to be able to make a connection because they don't really know who that is within their community. There's no teacher, there's no adult named that within their lives. So then there's this notion of the tank of gas, right, for a trip, commuting to work, another weekend trip. Again, my students' context was using public transportation. When you use public transportation, you're not really aware of how much gas is being consumed or if there's gas being consumed. So as I began to think through my problem, I knew that my students would be able to make a connection to thinking about the balance on a smart trip card, the walking distance from either their metro train or the metro bus stop to our campus, or even the distance walking from a central location to our school. So as I begin to think about those areas, now I'm more in the developing stage, right? Because I'm embedding this problem in the community of my students, knowing that my students personally all came to school using public transportation. So already I've created this problem. I'm beginning to think about this problem from the emerging stage to the developing stage. And the next push for me is obviously for me to get to the exemplary stage of creating or redesigning a culturally relevant task. But now I'm going to think about the equity piece. So knowing that our campus is in a new location, my students are having to travel longer distances to campus. And there are some students where they might be commuting on either metro train or metro bus for an hour, versus there might be some students that take some 30 minutes to walk. So I could really push myself as their teacher to think about, how do I bring that issue, that equity issue of we all have different amounts of time to get to school, and use fractions to try to solve that problem, right? Or to just bring light to that problem. So that is one way that we can take a task that's given to us from our curriculum, and we can begin to redesign it. We can begin to redesign it by considering the rubric of the what of a culturally relevant task, and now to begin to think about the 3 layers that I know, the critical practices that I know, and how I can begin to adapt this task. Oh, you're on mute, Amy.
Well, now that would probably help if I unmuted myself. Well, I was saying, thank you, Liz. That was a really great example, and I appreciate you talking through that. So now we're going to give you guys a chance to try it. This is another Eureka task. It's a first grade task, and it stems from operations and algebraic thinking first grade standard. So the task in Eureka, as it lives now, is we had one upper grade buddy come visit with 9 more buddies following him. Soon after that, 5 more buddies came to our classroom. How many buddies came all together? So similar to what Liz was talking about, if you're in a school where they don't have a buddy program, I know it's somewhat common, but in many schools there's not a buddy program where upper grade kids come and visit with their lower grade buddies. Chances are this context isn't going to have a lot of meaning for your students, but this is a really important math standard, and as we get to know our students, we know that there's a lot of context for adding numbers within 20. Also, with even if we want to keep to the visiting aspect of this context. So what we'd like you to do is take a minute, think about this problem, think about the math that's in this problem, and align that side by side with what you know about your students, and think about how could you revise, redesign this task to kind of bump it up on the cultural relevance rubric. So we're going to give you, let's say, a minute and a half, and we'll see where folks are at that point. And then we invite you to share.
And feel free to share through the chat. We are also very aware that our cultural knowledge of our students may not be at that deep, but we want you all to give it a try. Just think about how could this task be more relevant to your students.
Okay. Just before we share, actually, Liz, I don't know the answer to your question. So just thinking about just one more thing to add to this. We were talking about this idea of the pathways you can choose. You can choose to adapt the curriculum that you are working with, which is potentially something that everyone needs to do. and the pathway of developing a culturally relevant task from scratch. I did notice in the beginning when folks were putting kind of some of their hopes for this session is to sort of learn how to develop a task from scratch like that, which is awesome. We decided to focus on this area of kind of the adapting of the task because we felt like sort of knowing that everybody at this point, at least in DC, I should say, is kind of handed a curriculum, that this adaptation piece is something that is an entry point for everyone, kind of regardless of where you are. So wondering if folks are able to add their questions in the chat. I'm thinking we are realizing that we can't actually have a conversation in this system. So wondering if folks want to add to the chat the sort of their attempts at adapting this Eureka task.
And there is no wrong answer, just FYI. We are very well aware that everyone's entry point into the session is different, but we wanted to do this activity to help you all think through how you could make a task that's given to you more adaptable to your students, more relevant to your students. Okay, we have a brave participant, Amy. I don't know if you saw that.
I did, yes. Would you like me to read?
Sure.
April, if you're okay with it. April suggests I would rephrase, and thank you. I would rephrase and maybe talk about siblings visiting from other classes because most of my students have older or younger siblings in the school. Awesome, excellent, thank you.
Absolutely. So just changing that language to your older sibling coming to visit, students will your first grade students will already make a connection to this problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you to our brave volunteer.
Okay. So we're going to move on to kind of the big rock takeaways that we have identified in building a culturally relevant task. So in thinking of these as takeaways, we want to make sure that folks kind of come away with this understanding that it's very important that you build deep cultural knowledge of your students. Secondly, that you need to center your math content in a real world context that has authentic meaning to your students. And again, with that authenticity piece, you want to design tasks that are authentic and empowering for your students. So I did see something else in the chat, so I just want to honor someone else. Oh, Alice, thank you, if I may share. Alice mentions perhaps the buddies could be meeting up at a protest or a march. The Young People's March a few years ago comes to mind. Excellent, thank you, Alice. We,
just to that point too, if you don't mind, just hang in there for a second.
Please.
Yep.
Hi, this is Lou, everyone. We could also ask an additional question, just even to Alice's point, right? Like why students might be visiting. So even if they are meeting up at the march, what kind of march do you think? There could be some surrounding teaching things around it. And well, you could put it in the task or even ask, right? What kind of march why might we be meeting up? What kind of protest, if there's a protest, Alice? There's nothing in the Eureka curriculum in mathematics that says you can't ask a question that's not about trying to find a numerical answer, right? Mm. And sometimes we do that. We jump right to this how many, which is automatically calculation mode, and we don't allow students to. We wanted to think about buddy, but not too deeply that they may have a question about it. And so, there's no rule against that. So that's a slight adaptation we could easily do. Ask a couple more meaningful popcorn questions around this, or insert it right into the task.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
absolutely.
Something that that reminded me of, and Alice, you'll recall from Capital City, we had And this is one of the reasons this task kind of stood out to me, was that at Capital City, we did lots of, we would celebrate learning frequently. And so visitors, we would invite family visitors to come in, and every family is different in terms of who could come, how many folks could come. And so there was kind of an inherent equity question around that problem. And so when I saw this problem, that was the first thing that came to mind for me in my previous setting, as something that you could really contextualize this problem and add to the kind of cultural relevance, because it was something that was important to all the students. It really mattered. So,
Great.
Raquel, hi. I sometimes forget to ask those popcorn questions, thinking, oh, my kindergarten math lesson I taught today. So thanks for the reminder. Thank you, Raquel.
Thank you. So that leads us to thinking about blind spots. Oh, Lou, you are on mute.
Yeah, one more point, because that's just a beautiful example. Thanks for sharing that, guys. You know, this is, if you're thinking, and I was just thinking about Raquel's statement, when we're thinking about young children, I see elementary teachers do this all the time in the reading circles that they have in the front of the classroom, the literature circles, when they're doing these read alouds. Teachers do this all the time. There's something though about math teaching where they don't do this, right? Where I have to stick to the math, stick to the numbers. And the part of teaching culturally relevant math, particularly in the elementary, at these lower levels, is this idea of seeing it as part of the social community, the social fabric, just talking about play, talking about the things we care about, and connecting it to the things we might talk about or do in the mathematics as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lou. So the last area we want to really think about are some blind spot areas. So we know that this work can be very challenging, and it requires us as educators to really put a lot of thought behind the intentionality of these tasks. So a blind spot that we may face could be ignoring the social justice piece, because it can make us feel uncomfortable to have these conversations with our students, right? So again, part of the CRCD rubric, the exemplary stage, is ensuring that your task has that social justice piece, and having it be an authentic social justice piece that your students are making a relevant connection to. And we may feel to shy away from that because we may not be equipped with the right resources, the right language. So it's really in our power, in our hands, to make sure we have those tools and resources so that we can push ourselves to include social justice issues within our math tasks. Wondering if anyone has any other ideas for what other possible blind spots could appear as we are digging into this work. Going to use my teacher wait time here. I think. Thank you, Shauna. Shauna has shared a resource in order for educators to have that language. Thank you for that.
Perhaps alongside of kind of thinking about, oh, sorry.
There's Alice shared another one. Not attending to the aftercare that is necessary with exploring issues of justice in the classroom. Example, restorative circles. Yeah, absolutely. Like making sure that follow through is there, not just presenting the problem, but what is that follow through that comes after? All right, I'm being conscious of time, and we do want to leave a space for any questions or wonderings here.
I was about to say, perhaps these things can be concurrent. We can have people talking about blind spots alongside of questions and wonderings, just to make double use of the time. So that was a lot in a very short amount of time, realizing we could, well, it's a lifetime journey, but we could probably spend an entire, semester digging into this work. Potentially there's a lot coming up for you, I'm sure. But if there's any questions or wonderings that you have, that we could address in the minutes that we have left. And there's lots of really wonderful thinking around blind spots coming up that I think speaks to the commitment everyone has to this work. Not providing an avenue to do something about issues that may arise while solving problems, not thinking that young children can handle sensitive conversations. Absolutely. Not only can they handle them, they need to be had. I think when we think that when kids are young, they don't, they're afraid to talk about these sorts of things, but they're thinking about them, and it's more fearful, I believe, not to talk about them. So thanks, Lou.
Well, the last part here is we are going to share our presentation link. If Amy you can just put that in the chat for our participants here. But these are some resources, and Amy and I really want to thank Dr. Matthews, because he was such a great mentor through this process, really guiding us and pushing our own thinking and practice, and providing also these resources that we are sharing here with you all, so that we could ground ourselves in our work that we discussed this evening. So I believe Amy has put the link for our Genially. So all of these are all links to these different resources here. You'll also have access to the culture tree and the CRCD rubric, so that you may begin your work around developing or designing culturally relevant math tasks. I just want to thank you, Amy. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us this evening. It was a pleasure being here with you all, and hopefully you all are walking away with one little piece of new knowledge and walking away with something that you might be able to begin working on tomorrow or next week, or for you to begin to think about your work for the following school year.
Yes, thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, and see you all next week. Please, you can email us at mathsci. Hi, Pam. Thanks for coming by. Pamela said, Pamela, I know that you just released a book. We've been sharing it with our colleagues, and so happy to continue reading your work as well. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Raquel, Laura, Amy, Liz. Thanks. Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. And there was a comment about your accents, by the way. I don't know if you saw that in chat.
Bermuda. Good. I like that. That's what I'm talking about.
Lou, as someone who hears Jamaican accents at home, I definitely heard the Caribbean in you.
Yes, awesome. Because
Lou's been feeling a little sensitive about this.
Yeah, I was teased. For some of you who came there, I was teased earlier yesterday, actually, about sounding American, and it just hurt me, right? So that's glad for somebody to say that. That really I'm really fickle. It really makes my day.
I thought you would appreciate that.
Yeah. No, hey guys, thank you for being vulnerable. Thanks for putting yourselves out there. It's we have to. This is a great space, right? People sharing their journeys and bringing people along as they come. I love it. I'm glad you guys have you jumped right in so willingly, and that's awesome to see. Awesome.
It's important. It's the most important work.
We're live on Facebook. Let me stop the live stream. Hey, everybody, goodbye, Facebook. Let's say goodbye to Facebook. Bye, Facebook.
Bye, Facebook.
Thank you, guys. Yeah. And so
we want to stop recording too.
Stop recording too.
Yeah.